Now, the Chair of the Standing Committee, Mr Tim Llewellyn.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tim Llewellyn, lay member, Diocese of St David's and Chair of the Governing Body Standing Committee. The purpose of the session I'm going to take you through now is to take you through the Standing Committee report, and I will assume that you've all read the report, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. When I propose recommendation number 2, which is the approval of the whole report, members will have a chance at that stage to comment or ask questions on any part of the report. When we are considering the first recommendation, I'd be grateful if you would just comment on that specific proposal. But before I talk about the recommendations, I'd like to highlight 5 sections to you in the report. The first one, paragraph 1, Standing Committee meetings. And the Archbishop has already alluded to this in his earlier address. Members of the governing body will be pleased to know that your Standing Committee will be holding an overnight meeting in May at which we will discuss on our strategic roles and responsibilities. Please note that the next triennium of the Standing Committee begins in 2024, and dioceses will be asked later this year to elect 1 cleric and 1 lay member from each diocese to membership of the Standing Committee for the new triennium. If you would like to know more about what membership of the Standing Committee entails, please speak to either me or Simon Lloyd, and we'd gladly explain a bit more to you if you're interested. If I could now turn to paragraph 8 of the report, where unfortunately there's a typographical error. The Reverend Christine Owen has left and of course has been replaced by the Reverend, the Reverend Christine Owen has of course replaced the Reverend Chancellor Pam Powell as the elected clerical member, not lay member, from the Diocese of St Asaph. Okay, so Reverend Christine Owen is replacing the Reverend Chancellor Pam Powell as a clerical member and not a lay member. Paragraph 15 relates to printed governing body reports. To help reduce the Church's environmental impact, the Standing Committee has decided to make the provision of digital copies of governing body papers the default options. Members who've specifically requested printed papers in advance have been provided with them as they arrived this morning. We have also overhauled how the meeting documentation is presented on the website, with each paper numbered with reference to the agenda and each session in a separate folder. And I hope that this is an improvement for members, but of course any feedback you have here, please do let us know. Paragraph 27, once again the Archbishop has referred to this earlier on, this is the gathering of the Church in Wales leaders. After holding 4 very useful joint meetings of the members of the Standing Committee, representative body and bench of bishops, it has been agreed to hold a further meeting, including those archdeacons and cathedral deans not already included by membership of the Standing Committee or representative body. Plans are being made for this to take place in the autumn of this year. And then finally, paragraph number 30, the Climate Change Hub Group. The Standing Committee is responsible for strategic oversight of the net zero climate agenda, reporting to the governing body, and a Climate Change Hub Group is to be set up, including the Archbishop as a member. So those are the 5 specific areas that I want to comment on, and I will now turn to the recommendations within the report. So the first recommendation I would like to put before you is that the Standing Committee warmly recommends Sue Rivers to be a governing body chair. Sue has extensive experience as the chair of governors for 2 school governing bodies, 1 secondary and 1 Church in Wales primary school, who were in special measures and are now out of Estyn monitoring, together with her relevant experience as the president of the Llandaff Diocese branch of the Mothers' Union. So, Chair, I would now like to propose that.
Thank you very much. And let me just note that the Vice Chair, Dr Heather Payne, is unable to be with us at Governing Body this week for COVID-related reasons, so I shall be seconding from the Chair. So can I ask Governing Body now if anyone wishes to raise a question or to make a comment on this specific motion? I see none. So therefore, can we therefore move to a vote? We'll be taking 4 against and abstentions. and the decision is by simple majority. So can I ask all those who are in favour of this motion, please to raise your cards. Thank you. Those against? Any abstentions? Unanimous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governing Body. So the second part is obviously now there's an opportunity for members to comment on any issues that are included in the report, and this is your opportunity.
So you are proposing the motion and I am seconding. So if anybody, please, if you'd like to come forward. Thank you very much. And as usual, can I remind you, please, to introduce yourselves as you begin. Don't be shy now.
Andrew Sims, Llandaff Lay. Thank you very much for the report and everything that's contained within it. Really wanted to just, for the sake of clarity, there were people who were expecting to have printed documents today, myself among them, because we have historically asked for paper documents and hadn't managed to gather that it was to reapply for paper documents, but also that perhaps we need to consider that if we're moving towards being paperless, which is fantastic, really on board with that, we need to make sure that the tables we provide are big enough to have 8 devices on top of them, and also to make sure that there are charging points in the middle of them, because if we want to get behind this, and I think it's really important that we do, we need to make sure that the sort of structure is there practically to encourage it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that is just noted. And you respond to all. Okay. So if we could, yes, have. Thank you.
Sarah Mulcahy, elected Monmouth. Again, it's on the printed papers. I again support the fact of not automatically sending out printed papers to everybody, but there are some people, I'm dyslexic, I can't read large volumes on a screen, and I certainly can't read a pack like that within an hour or so of getting a pack when I arrive at a meeting. I know certainly when I was younger I would not have stood up and admitted I was dyslexic and that I couldn't do this. So there may be lots of people who have got difficulties for various reasons and they can't use the electronic format and need the papers in advance of the meeting. So I think there should be the option, and John very kindly did send me my papers, but I had to specifically request and explain why I would like them in advance. And the other point I wanted to make, which is probably more controversial, is the papers that come out are obviously bilingual, which I agree with, but could it be that they were printed separately in English and Welsh so that you would halve the amount of paper that was used and people could request them in whichever language?
Chair, Jonathan Wright, elected cleric, Swansea and Brecon Diocese. There's 3 points that I would like to raise. On paragraph 29, which is safeguarding matters, I note that in the Monmouth review report, the Standing Committee undertook a major decision as part of that, and it's not listed within this. I wonder whether there's a point here about ensuring that major decisions are recorded formally in the report of all the Standing Committee meetings. Secondly, with regard to paragraphs 39 to 41, I'm grateful that this decision has been made, but I wonder what's the time frame for these being made available. They weren't available online yesterday. I wonder when these will be in place. And will the publication of minutes also include subcommittee reports to the Standing Committee, so that at least members of governing body could also see those? Would this practice be also recommended for dioceses? And finally, I noticed that in this Standing Committee report, which covers the last 4 meetings of the Standing Committee, there's no mention of work undertaken with regard to the release of the £100 million. Has that been an agenda item on Standing Committee meetings, or is that just not referenced because it's dealt with elsewhere? Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Yeah.
So first of all, thanks very much for the comments there, and I'll speak to Andrew and Sarah's points first. All very valid points that have been made, and we'll certainly take them on board and understand how best we can react to them. But thank you very much for your comments there. Jonathan, thanks very much for yours. As far as the 100 million bit, I'll deal with that first. It hasn't been ignored by Standing Committee, but it's very much a representative body issue, so the main decision-making and discussions are very much within the auspices of the representative body rather than the Standing Committee. We'll duly note your comments regarding the minutes, and we will clarify in terms of the timescales as to when those will be published. And certainly as far as the major decisions, we'll once again reflect on that, but I will also update on the Monmouth report in my next session there. So if there's anything specific around the safeguarding, we can use that as an opportunity there. Thank you very much, though.
So thank you very much, Governing Body. Is there anybody else who wishes to make a comment or raise a question? In which case we may now move to the vote. Again, it will be those for, those against and those abstaining, with Mr Tim Llewellyn proposing and myself seconding. So can I ask you please to raise your cards if you're voting in favour of this motion, that the report of the Standing Committee be approved. Thank you. Anybody against? Any abstentions? It seems we are again unanimous. So thank you very much indeed. And that concludes our discussion, our consideration of the report of Standing Committee. So we now move to Agendum 8, which is the Monmouth Review Implementation Group. And you again have a document about that. And I apologise that I am one of those who's got a printed copies, because it's much easier for me at this point from the chair to work with bits of paper in my hand that I can wave at you and have several documents open before me at once. So the report of the Monmouth Review Implementation Group, which will be introduced by the Chair of Standing Committee. Thank you, Tim Llewellyn.
So, Archbishop Chair, I'm still Tim Llewellyn, I'm still from the Diocese of St David's, but this time I'm Chair of the Monmouth Review Implementation Report. So, the Monmouth Review Implementation Group was established formally in late January 2022 and met for the first time in March 2022. In that time, much progress has been made in responding to the 28 recommendations within the Monmouth Review report, a report which gave us much food for thought and showed that in a number of very important areas, our processes and policies were lacking coherence and rigour. At the governing body's meeting in April last year, responding to a question time question from the Dean of Newport, I said that I hoped significant progress would be made by the end of 2022, and it is pleasing to be able to report that the majority of the recommendations have either been implemented fully or are close to being so. The report you have amongst your papers sets out the position. You will see that of the 28 recommendations, 19 are fully implemented, and the report indicates those which are outstanding. Some of these are inevitably going to take longer due to their wide-ranging nature and complexity. Others, such as those relating to bishops' medical and well-being support and their induction, should be concluded quite shortly. A key process step, one which was recognised in the review report itself, is the triage meeting of staff, which discusses and monitors people-related casework. The oversight of casework this provides, almost without effort, addresses a number of the recommendations, and you will see from the report the Standing Committee approved terms of reference for this group in February upon the Implementations Group recommendation. The terms of reference have been appended to the report for your information. I would like to take this opportunity to remind the governing body of the Church in Wales Dignity Charter, which once again the Archbishop referred to earlier on, plus also you've got a paper copy on your table, which you approved in 2022. This was a key recommendation of the report, and whilst it's very easy to publish a charter, it only becomes a living charter when we truly live and breathe it in all that we do. The provincial team have produced this poster, and the QR code will take you through to the full charter. But I would ask you rhetorically, what is it that you are doing in your own churches to keep it real and alive? You will see from the report that Archdeacon Stella Bailey from the Gwent Valleys has been appointed recently as a member of the group, following Dr. Sian Miller's departure from the province. This may seem unusual given the group has now completed the majority of its work, but the group was keen that even so it retained as many voices and sets of eyes as possible, and we were not content to be without a female member. Given the progress that has been made, the group feels it does not need to meet as frequently and has agreed to meet next in the autumn. In the meantime, though, I'm meeting with staff in June to discuss the outstanding work and what has happened in the interim period. In closing, I would like to say a sincere thank you to my fellow members on the group, namely the Archbishop, the Most Reverend Andrew John, the Chair of the representative body, Professor Medwyn Hughes, the former Chair of the Standing Committee, Dr. Sian Miller, the Archdeacon of St David's, the Venerable Paul McNess, the Archdeacon of the Gwent Valleys, the Venerable Stella Bailey, and the Right Reverend Tim Thornton, our independent member. I'm also deeply indebted to members of the provincial team, namely the Provincial Secretary, Canon Simon Lloyd, the Head of Legal Services, Mr Matthew Chinnery, and the Governance Officer, Mr John Davis, who keeps us all on the straight and narrow. Chair, that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. So if members have questions or comments that they would like to make, again, I'd be grateful if you would come to the front.
Richard Mulcahy, Monmouth Co-opted. Two things to start with. One, this is not a family meeting, despite appearances, but both my wife and I have spoken in 3 successive votes. We are planning to take over the whole of the meeting later, but we'll let you know when it's time for you to go. Secondly, as well, others might remember that I spoke on the previous report of this committee last year when we were in Newport. This time I'm going to avoid colourful metaphors and focus on the fact that I'm very pleased that we have made what appears to be considerable progress. There's a number of the recommendations have been taken forward. My concern comes in 2 main areas. One is that this is not visible outside governing body and the relevant committees, I feel. I wouldn't want this report as such to be put to the PCCs and MACs, but because it's written in committee ease. Now, I may be fluent in it, but many people aren't. We need something perhaps simpler to explain what has happened. But also, when we say it's quite difficult to change culture, yes, but we're not the only people trying to do it. Again, speaking to my other job, we've had a whole range of issues about bullying, mistreatment, and the rest in the civil service. We've spent a lot of time trying to work out ways to stop people pushing their way through past others. And it does take time, and it's not simple. But there are lots of other people who are doing this, and people we can learn from and take that forward, rather than what at the moment looks to be a too difficult pile. Diolch.
Can I take the 2 others as well, and then that will allow Tim to respond to everything together.
Thank you, Chair. Martin Donnelly, new member from Swansea and Brecon. I wanted, first of all, to say a big thank you to everyone who's produced this piece of work. I think it's really valuable. And just 2 comments. One, I want to take away the challenge that the culture issue is for all of us, all the time. And we just cannot ever forget that, because these issues cannot be left to others. And you can never complete the culture change. It's always got to continue. And the second one is just to ask about follow-up. I think it's very valuable that the group is meeting again in the autumn, and I wonder whether we can, in some way that seems most appropriate, have at least an annual review together of how we are doing, what new areas may be coming up to challenge us, and how we try to be proactive in managing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
John Sadler, co-opted member. One thing from the Monmouth report, it said, we've been talking a lot about culture, it said that the prevalence of swearing and excessive intake of alcohol among bishops and senior clergy was commented upon by several witnesses in their evidence to us, and by the Bishop of Monmouth himself in his evidence both to Mr Elias and to the HR business partner. I was just wondering about an update on what this culture is today, whether it's still that case, and what's being done about it. Thank you.
Bishop Gregory. I have made no link whatsoever between one speaker and the next.
Gregory Cameron, Bishop of St Asaph, ex officio. I'll resist the temptation to attempt answering John's comments, but I'm sure Tim can speak on behalf of the bench of bishops. We're a much more sober lot, I assure you, these days. I'm very grateful to the chair of the implementation group for this report, and indeed for the comments of the Archbishop about the Dignity Charter and the need for further work to be done on it. The words of the Charter are very fine indeed and aspirational, but they will remain aspirational words unless there is a clear plan of implementation, clear lines of accountability, particularly for those in senior office, and accessible processes by which concerns may be raised and resolved. I also notice that in the original recommendation, the production of a dignity charter was recommended, but also the development of a training package to go with that. So implementation, accountability, processes of raising concerns and resolution, and a training package. I wonder whether Tim could say a little bit more about when that work will be achieved and who will be undertaking it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So first of all, thanks very much for your comments and feedback on the activities of the report. I'll pick up on some of the themes that were raised in the questions there. Quite rightly, we were challenged there about how do we make this visible? How do the people in our communities and our congregations see and feel what it is that we are doing? Some things I have to be honest about, I think are perhaps more backroom procedures and processes, but I would very much hope that the way that people would see it is the way that if ever they needed to rely on those policies and those procedures, that the way they would be implemented would be far better than they have been hitherto. But then there are some very visible things in terms of the Dignity Charter. That's something tangible, but and I'll come back to that in a second. There is one thing that I've been continually reflecting on, though, is that whilst the Monmouth report highlighted things specifically for one diocese, the outputs of which very much relate to the whole province, to hopefully avoid a similar situation coming in then. But I'm very conscious that somehow I feel we need to be handing this back to Monmouth. This is where it started. So what does that hand back look like? What does that closing of the loop look like? And that's something that I want to be discussing with Bishop Cherry as to how, what does the diocese want from us in terms of, well, we've done our work, but how do we sort of hand this back? But that's not just to say this is Monmouth in isolation. It applies to us all. The cultural piece is a very interesting one. An old boss of mine used to say the best way to describe culture is being something that this is what happens around here. But actually, for us to assess culture and whether we're making an impact of it, that's how we all are. How do we interact with each other today? How did we interact with people last night? What do we do as a result of us being here for the next 2 days when we go back to our homes and our places of work? Culture is what we do. How do we do it? Yes, we could look at ways of how do we assess that. You can have cultural indices and things like that. But for me, the best way we do it is how do we actually interact day to day with our colleagues. And it's very difficult to actually make that a quantitative type approach. I think it is always going to be a more qualitative. I'm not going to stand here and comment on the culture of the bench. I don't think I'm qualified to do that. But I think, once again, that's for you to all observe. That's for you to all understand. But the thing that I see about the bench is I think we have a very approachable people who really want to work with us and be part of us. And that's very much the impression and the reflections I've got of the bench. having been used to working with senior teams in the past, I find this particular senior team as the most approachable and responsible team I've been involved with, and that's my reflection of the culture that they're generating. And finally, I'm very grateful for comments regarding the way that the Dignity Charter has been taken thus far. And I think I can work with Beck in the HR team. Is there more that we can do in terms around things like training packages? Because I think what I'm hearing is there's a desire to make this real, to make this alive. And if there's more that we can do to support that, I'm all for that. So thank you.
Yes. I'm wondering whether the chair of the Monmouth Review Implementation Group would like to take that dignity package issue to and consult the chair of the steering committee about taking it further.
I'll talk to myself.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
So thank you everyone on that. So that concludes addendum item 8, as we're not asked to take any action further on that formally as the governing body. So we'll move now to addendum 9, which is question time. And you will have received in your pack the document listing 3 questions. So can I ask the proposers of the 3 questions to come forward and be ready here? Let me say that the current practice is that the questions will not be read out. The answers will be given, and then the questioner may make a brief comment after hearing the answer or ask one supplementary question. So the first question is from Mrs. Hannah Wilkinson, the Diocese of St. David's, which relates to email addresses. And I also need those who are answering to come forward if that's appropriate. And so the answer to this question will be given by our brand new Director of IT. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, please, sir.
Chair, Your Grace, members of governing body. A request was made by the diocesan secretaries to the RB's IT department.
Your name, sir.
My name.
Mike, please give your name.
After 7 years, I should know. Mike Wakeman.
Thank you.
A request was made by the diocesan secretaries to the RB's IT department in 2020 to provide email addresses to all clergy. This was possible to deliver at no cost to the diocese because of the way that the Office 365 software licenses are provided to us. A list of clergy was provided by each diocese, and an Office 365 account, including the email address, was made available to every cleric on those lists. The IT department notified each cleric of the existence of the new account and provided access details. In addition, help desk services were made available to clergy to provide support for login issues or usage problems. The IT department is part of the RB and has no mandate to compel usage of the new accounts. As such, each diocesan bishop were free to determine how they wanted their clergy to use the new accounts. Some requested that clergy use their addresses as their professional point of contact. Others were content to let clergy do so on a voluntary basis. Usage therefore varies quite markedly across dioceses, as you can see in the table that is displayed behind me. The first column of the table shows the number of accounts that were created in each diocese. The second shows usage over a 30-day period to the 12th of April 2023. The figure in brackets provides a percentage of the total active accounts that were used in that time frame, and the final 2 columns show the volume of traffic received and sent by the active accounts, regardless of whether they were accessed by the users or not. If you aggregate the percentage, the top line figure is that 44% of Church in Wales email accounts that have been provided to clergy have been used within the 30-day period. That leaves 56 that were inactive during that same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hannah, if you'd like to make a response to that.
Hannah Wilkinson, St David's Diocese. I'd like to thank you very much for looking into those figures. The question was actually asked by my husband, who was finding it quite difficult to contact some of his fellow clergy and wondering whether the Church in Wales email address system was making matters worse. some people have openly admitted that they never use their email account, which we find a bit surprising. And also, he's finding much time is wasted trying to contact people and wondering what could be done about this, because multiple email addresses can make it quite difficult to contact people. And looking at those figures, there's some quite big discrepancies, and therefore was wondering whether it was worth having a diocese-based system or a system rather than a universal system. Thank you.
Right, do you want to respond to that, or do you want to just take that away and process later? Thank you very much. Thank you. So we now move to the second question, which has been asked by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Wright, Diocese of Swansea and Brecon. This is relating to ordination and selection for ordination, and it will be answered by the Bishop of Monmouth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cherry Van, Bishop of Monmouth, and the Bishop with the ministry portfolio. Thank you, Jonathan, for your question. I shall begin my answer by first outlining the process that candidates go through at provincial discernment panels. When candidates attend a provincial discernment panel, they are graded by each of the discerners with whom they meet individually and the chair of the discernment panel, with a grade between A to D. These individual grades are then collated and moderated by the provincial discernment panel to produce a final overall grade for each candidate, again ranging from A to D. An overall grade of either A or B indicates that the candidate either meets all of the discernment criteria or the vast majority of the criteria, and that the recommendation of the panel is that the candidate go forward for training. An overall grade of C or D indicates that the candidate does not meet the discernment criteria, and the recommendation of the panel is that the candidate does not go forward for training. However, the nature of the discernment process means that a candidate who was not recommended for training would be unlikely to receive this recommendation without a degree of nuance. Many candidates who are not recommended for training by the panel are deemed to have a discernible vocation, but at the time of discernment were not deemed to sufficiently meet the criteria, possibly due to lack of experience or personal circumstances. In these cases, the panel will note in the reports that are prepared for the bishops that such candidates could return to a future panel after a time of appropriate reflection, preparation, and demonstrable commitment to exploring their sense of calling. Equally, many candidates who are not recommended for training by the panel are not deemed to meet the criteria for ordained ministry, but might be thought to display the required qualities for another calling, for example, as authorized lay ministers. Once the panel has discerned their recommendations for each candidate and the reports have been prepared, it is then up to each of the diocesan bishops concerned to further discern what the next step will be for each candidate. The provincial discernment panel has always acted in a purely advisory capacity, and bishops may, at their discretion, accept or reject the panel's recommendations. In some cases, this has resulted in candidates who have not been recommended by the panel going forward for training. As this final decision rests with the individual bishops, records are not kept by either the chair or the coordinator to the provincial discernment panels about how many candidates who were not recommended then go on for further training and discernment at the St. Padans Institute. Anecdotally, we are aware of cases in recent years where candidates have been put forward for training against the recommendations of the panel. However, the lack of provincial records of these decisions, the movement and retirement of bishops, the change from St Michael's College to the St Padans Institute, and the necessary precautions not to risk potentially identifying individuals concerned means that we are unable to give a concrete figure for the time frame of the question. With regards to the total numbers of candidates who have been recommended to go forward for training by the Provincial Discernment Panel in the years 2013 to 2022, of the 187 candidates who were presented at panel, 141 were recommended for training. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Cherry. Jonathan, do you want to? He does.
Chair, we're left in a rather, I wish to make a short comment. We're left in the rather incredible position that no records are kept of what should be one of the most important features of our human resource area of the church, who is put forward to ministry. This smacks of a lack of accountability of the bench and its decisions. Is the role of the Provincial Selection Board being held to account? Is it fit for purpose? Does it need reform? Or is it working really well? In looking at how these figures are put together, it would also be helpful to see if there is the bench are working collaboratively together, or whether that in particular dioceses the recommendations are regularly being ignored. I think it would be helpful for the future, and I understand that a piece of work is ongoing as to a reform of the process, if this figure was kept, at least so it could be in a way that didn't reveal the particular identities of candidates, could be reported to the governing body. Thank you.
Thank you. Bishop Cherry.
Thank you. I understood it was a comment rather than a question, so I won't attempt to answer the questions, but Jonathan and I have had a conversation about this already, and I have assured him that the new Director of Ministry Development has at the top of his priorities work ongoing with the Provincial Discernment Panel and the whole process of discernment to vocations, both to lay and ordained ministry.
Thank you very much. So our third question from Ms. Susan Fogarty of the Diocese of Bangor, which relates to the Evangelism Fund, Inclusion and Diversity, and this will be answered by the Archbishop.
Susan, thank you for your question. Really grateful to receive it. The Church in Wales voted at the meeting of the governing body in September 2021 to authorise the blessing of same-sex relationships following civil arrangements. This was a further step towards the inclusion described in this question and followed an earlier provision of prayers authorised by the bench in April 2016 for same-sex couples. We ought to note that for many LGBTQI+ Christians, this was too little and too late. For other Christians, it was too much and too soon. We should therefore be cautious when asserting the Church in Wales has a clearly stated position on inclusion and diversity. Those who worship in the Church in Wales take a range of views on issues of human sexuality, and the bishops have not sought to impose uniformity in this area. Christians often develop in their understanding of human relationships. What facilitates serious engagement is respectful conversation and the freedom to disagree well. These are critical conditions which allow people to develop and to change their views or even retain their convictions respectfully. The representative body is committed to working with the bishops towards a Church in Wales which is well resourced to make new disciples who grow in their faith across the whole range of church traditions. Each diocese, when looking to establish new ministries or to provide new resources for existing ones, takes proper regard of the ethos and understanding of any organisation with whom we might work. This includes the Church Revitalisation Trust, who work to establish church plants in the UK. If I just may add one further comment which has been brought to me, Chair, after writing this, that the Bishop of St Asaph informed me that in their discussions with CRT, they sought explicit assurances from them about inclusion. They sought them and were given them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan, do you want to ask a question or make a comment? Thank you.
Thank you, Your Grace, and thank you, Governing Body, for this opportunity. I think that finally you answered the question and gave me the reassurance in your final comment with Bishop Gregory's obtaining from Hope Street Church that their explicit support for inclusion. And that's the reassurance that I was hoping for. So thank you both. Thank you.
Yes, I don't think that needs a follow-up. So thank you very much to all those who asked questions. And of course, a reminder to everybody that there is this capacity each time we meet as governing bodies. If there's something gnawing at you, do get in touch with those who organise these things, and they will help you find a good way of proposing the question in a way that gets to the heart of the matter, so that we can actually have that response in the course of our governing body meeting. So that concludes agenda item 9, and so we turn forward to the Bench of Bishops report and questions to the bench. We have addendum 10, the document before you. The Archbishop will introduce the report, and then we will invite governing body to ask any questions about the report from him or other members of the bench.
Chair, thank you very much. Andrew, Archbishop. The report before you on addendum number 10 falls into two parts: a synopsis of material that has been on our agendas in the last period since we met, and also a breakdown of the portfolio responsibilities given to each of the bishops. I'm not going to recite or go through those synopses at all. I shall expect that you will have read, but we will, of course, as bishops, respond to any questions that you may have. Can I add one thing, which is that the pattern of meeting that the bench have committed itself to in the last year, I drew attention to this very briefly at the last time that we met, is important. We now meet on a much more regular basis. When we meet together over a 3-day period, we've committed ourselves for the first part of that time together, about a day and a half, to be praying, to be reading scripture, to be listening to one another about the joys and the sorrows of episcopal ministry. And that's a clear commitment that we're making to one another, to see ourselves as a bench, a group of people who belong to one another and to the church. We're taking responsibility for holding ourselves accountable to one another, but also investing in one another and in our ministries. That process of careful listening and of building each other up, I think, will be transformational in our life together. The second part of that 3-day is given to much more strategic work when we're joined by members of the national team, and we try to keep the focus on big picture material that we think is necessary and relevant to the Church in Wales. We also meet overnight for one 24-hour period in which the much more operational work, some of which is described in this report, is on our agenda. And we hope to keep that balance together so that we find ourselves taking responsibility for the broad direction of life within the Church in Wales, but inevitably giving ourselves time to deal with the business and the everyday concerns that we need to as bishops. In the light of that, please do be forthcoming. As before, I will hope that colleagues will be able to assist in any questions that you may have for us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. If those who would like to raise questions or make comments would like to come to the front on this side, please. Who's going first? Well, one of you, please.
Chris Dearden, lay member, lay clerk, Bangor. I'm not sure what I'm about to ask has been gnawing at me, Chair, but I'll ask it anyway. If through you I could thank the Archbishop for the insight which he's given into the way that the bench of bishops is working together at the moment. I would say to the bench that never underestimate just how important it is that they work together as a close and well-functioning and cooperative and collaborative team. One thing I wanted to just, I suppose, run past you. We heard earlier that the Standing Committee is to start publishing its minutes, something the representative body already does, as does the governing body, of course, ourselves. I'm not aware that the bench does, or even if any minutes are taken. There's obviously parts of your meetings which are not appropriate to be minuted, perhaps. But I wondered if it was worth asking if the bench would consider producing more expansive details of what it's discussed than simply the report which we get at a governing body. Whether it's worth considering that, or perhaps if we'll end up in a situation like that children's programme Sesame Street from back in the day, which had a feature. 3 of these kids are doing the same thing. One of these kids is doing its own thing. I'll take an answer from any of the bench, or from Cookie Monster, or from Big Bird.
Yes, I'll take the liberty of chipping in from here that when I supported the work of the Bench of Bishops in Southern Africa, they issued a sort of narrative press release just to let the province as a whole be aware of what was on their hearts and minds, and that was found quite useful. So I just toss that in.
Do you want me to respond now?
Would you like to, or would you like to take more comments?
No, I'll respond to that immediately, if I may. That sounds a sensible suggestion that we will take to the bench for discussion.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Lightbourne, elected clergy, Monmouth Diocese. Thank you very much, and thank you for the transparency of your report, both in the narrative comment and in the list of who does what, so to speak, and where there's obviously gaps of who's not doing things at present. But just reading this and listening to the presidential address and so on, there is something that's slightly nagging at me, and I know the whole bench is implicitly committed to issues of socio-economic justice and the poor in this land, but it doesn't feel very explicit. So in the list of responsibilities, we've got specifically responsibility for the environmental issue, for the evangelism bid and so on, but the poor and the socially economic disadvantaged aren't explicitly referenced. Is there a way of bringing that implicit commitment that I know you all have to make it more explicit, so that in things like the evangelism bid, in all of our policy making and round the environmental issue, the poor, the socially economically disadvantaged, the voiceless aren't forgotten, but they sit somewhere near the top, and we just remind ourselves at all time that we are a church that cares deeply about the poor and perhaps even has a bias towards the poor.
Thank you so much for that question. That seems to me eminently sensible. I will again also take that back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Hannah Rowan, co-opted member for Monmouth Diocese. Thank you very much for the report and to all the bench. I'd like to say something briefly and then ask a couple of questions in relation to the section around relationships of power and vulnerability in church-based contexts. And it came out of recommendation 6.6 from the Monmouth Review Implementation Group. But my question is broader than that, in that I think it's a question for us as a province as a whole. I'm very mindful that it can be very uncomfortable to talk about power within the church. It can feel very difficult. But being accountable for how we manage power dynamics is deeply, deeply important. And I think we should be leaders in this field as a church. And so I welcomed the nuance of the description of those who can be vulnerable in a church context, and was interested to see that you've commissioned the doctrinal commission to look into the practical theology position around this. I am interested also in how this has affected our systems, or how it will affect our systems. And linked to that, I'd like to understand if we have a clear sense of the areas of vulnerability in our church activities as a whole. And I'd like to just give one small example for that, which is that there are power imbalances inherent in some good and necessary elements of church life. And I'm going to use formation for ministry as an example. And I suppose my question is, what are we doing at a system level to ensure that those with the least power are able to raise concerns without fear over how that might affect their future? And I think it links to the question around culture, because quite often there's a difference between, I think, as Tim said, how things really are around here and what the policies look like. So really welcome the nuance of the comment that you've given, the recognition that power imbalances exist and that we're accountable for managing them, and would like to know a little more about what's practically happening in relation to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder whether there is anything that Bishop Cherry might like to say about the way in which, well, anything really.
I'm not managing to catch her eye.
More seriously, I think the way in which we now expect respectful engagement between incumbents and curates, and the way in which relationships are being managed from the training institute up. And then I'll have something to say, Cherry, perhaps more broadly than that, but perhaps you might want to say something about that in the first instance.
Thank you, Hannah. I mean, this is a really difficult one, isn't it? And I think we've mentioned culture a number of times today, and various people in this room have made really important comments and observations. It's something that we have to be mindful of all the time. There's not a quick fix or even a long-term fix. It's something we have to be attentive to continually, and particularly those of us who hold positions of power and responsibility within the church. I think it's an ongoing discussion, really. I don't have any answers particularly, but I think the fact that you've raised the question is really important and something that we need to continue to look at. And perhaps it's another thing that we as a bench need to pay attention to. It isn't just the bishops, of course. There are plenty of other people in the church that hold power over others. I think it's probably true to say, and the Monmouth Review highlights it, the Monmouth report highlights it, that we've not been very good at either recognising it or indeed addressing it. So I think your question is really timely. We will be looking at that as a bench and looking at how we can address that systematically in an ongoing way that's not just a kind of statement or one response, but is an ongoing attentiveness to your concern, which we should all be concerned about.
I could also say thank you, Hannah. I think that was a very very relevant and important question. We haven't been systematic about this, and that's partly because I think we're discovering as we journey different things that we hadn't thought of. Let me just add two things more. First of all, the Dignity at Work Charter, which has been very helpfully referenced by the chair of the Standing Committee, and I made mention of it in my own address. I think it's really important, as the Bishop of St. Asaph encouraged us, to be really quite systematic in the way in which we work through the implications of that charter, because that both brings levels of accountability that we've not seen before, perhaps, but also affects culture. We do, of course, have an RB policy on whistleblowing as well, and I think that there is something to be developed further there, again, in order to give outlets and valves, but also to change the culture and to redefine and reframe the way in which engagement and relationships take place within the life of the church. But I think my takeaway from your question is to perhaps invite the standing committee to think more thoroughly and more comprehensively about the range of activities and to make sure that it's sufficiently comprehensive and deep in order to be fit for purpose. So thank you for that. There's some takeaway from this. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Peter.
Your Grace, Chair and members, Peter Lewis, elected in Llandaff for the moment. A quick question really about the allocation of jobs for the bishops. I really understand, having chatted to a number of you recently, that the amount of work that you have to do at a provincial level is huge, in addition to the diocesan role. But as one of the clergy in the South East Wales Deaf Church Association, I noticed that the deaf church is at the bottom of the list of areas which bishops need to oversee. And I just wanted to bring to our attention in the governing body, but particularly to the bench of bishops as you try and allocate that role, that we're in a bit of tension really in Wales with all the deaf communities of really needing some insight that brings us all together. And I think within that particular role of overseeing the deaf communities, there's real opportunity for doing something, maybe even related to some of the funds of money which are going to come aboard, that we can really encourage people within the deaf and hearing community to understand how God is working within lives in that group of people. So as a recommendation that whoever's going to take that position, that you work maybe with some of the people who are very disparate around the different areas of Wales to try and move forward in a really positive way. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. I think what we'll do is we'll take that to bench and wonder whether or not there may be some CMD opportunity here for the whole church. Thank you. It's a really important question.
Your Grace, Chair, two specific questions. The first, as I note in the section on bishops, advisors and staff structures, that 3 additional directors are going to be appointed in the areas of public affairs, strategic communications and mission. When I arrived in where I minister presently, there were 5 stipendiary clergy. There are now 2. I wonder how, as we hollow out the number of clergy on the ground in stipendiary ministry, how these 3 new directors are going to help us re-engage and grow. And secondly, given that one bishop is currently on extended sick leave, how is that bishop's portfolio managed by the rest of the bench?
Yes.
Ian Black, Dean of Newport, nominated Dean. Actually, that's the kind of question I was wanting to pick up on, the final point that's just been made, and that is that looking through the portfolio allocations, clearly there is one bishop who's on extended sick leave, but there are also other areas that are not allocated, and we've heard of one, the chaplain to the deaf. We've heard of some absences, which you're going to take and discuss. My question is, how are you addressing the areas that are not currently allocated, or where there are vacancies in, or where work's not being picked up at the moment? How is that impeding the work streams that flow from these portfolio allocations? And how are you as the bench addressing that and taking that forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Ian. In relation to that last point, which you've both alluded to, I asked the bench if they were happy with me taking Bishop Joanna's responsibility around climate and spent a good part of my presidential address thinking about the way in which we can respond well to issues of climate, the new climate change hub, and we'll be doing an awful lot, as I mentioned, in 2024 in relation to that. So that's sort of navigated its way into my portfolio very happily. The truth is that sometimes the bishops are so busy and so needing to balance the provincial as well as the diocesan work that sometimes we just have to press pause. That's the honest answer. And if we find things that come our way that are an emergency, we will deal with them. But inevitably, if there are things that are of a more developmental character, I'm afraid they are just put on pause until we can get ourselves into a place where we can do something well with them. Jonathan, we don't anticipate the number of clergy decreasing. In fact, we need our clergy on the ground, and we are planning a future with as many clergy as the church can afford. Some of the appointments that you referenced are replacement. We remember Carol Wardman and her role. There's been a change of title, but the role is essentially intact, and so is a like for like. One of the things that we've seen, I think, as life has become more complex, is that we do need levels of support as bishops, as well as for the church more broadly, which have been absent from our life. So I do expect that these appointments around, for example, CMD, around the way in which we generate effective communications in a digital age, and the way in which we engage with our governments, all of these are really significant challenges, and they're beyond, not the can, but they're beyond the work capacity, I think, of the bishops to deliver well on them. So we need the kind of support that these officers will bring, and I think that we will all see improvements in each of those areas as a consequence.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else who would like to comment or raise a question in relation to the report from the Bench of Bishops? So, one more coming.
Caroline Woolard, elected lay Monmouth. Chair, Your Grace, a very quick question on the faculty review system. I suspect faculties are close to all our hearts in one way or the other. I know it's very early days, but do we have any sense of whether or not this work has started yet, and when you're anticipating the review to be completed?
Thank you very much. We had to delay till 2024 because we wanted to access the services of course, Professor Norman Doe, and he wasn't available until 2024, but he's committed himself within that year to a completion of the report. We don't have more details yet. It will depend on how thorough, how deep the work. I suspect it will be a substantial piece of working, aided by the property department within the Church in Wales, and by others as well. We expect this to be not a light touch, but a really deep piece of work, because we're conscious of how challenging and sometimes frustrating the issue of faculties is for the life of the church. We want to get it right.
Thank you.
Your Grace, bench, members of the governing body. Andrew Sims, Llandaff Diocese. I suppose this is an emerging thing that as different people have spoken about issues that are particularly close to their hearts, I'm thinking that are some of the titles of the specialisms that the bench are working with fit for purpose? Because the church as a whole, I think, is profoundly committed to working with all sorts of communities with very specific needs and who are different in all sorts of different ways. And that maybe what we need to be thinking about is a bigger picture of inclusion and somebody whose specialism is around the broader picture of protected characteristics and what those mean, because there are many protected characteristics, and I think it's about trying to work out how we're responding positively to each of those, and to avoid kind of the sticking plaster of trying to respond to groups as they come and say, well, what about us, please? And I just think maybe that's something that the bench might like to consider in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really helpful. A review of the portfolios takes place regularly, but you've pointed out yet another gap. And so we'll go back to that and have a look at it. Thank you.
Kate O'Sullivan, Clergy, Monmouth Diocese. This goes back to Hannah's comments about sort of good practice, good culture. And I suppose the thing I would like to flag is that the Dignity Charter is great. But unless it's adopted by ministry area councils, it's, in a really serious way, it's going to be useless. I also think that our policies need to acknowledge the fact that it's easy to assume that the person that is being bullied and the person that is holding power is ordained. because actually sometimes they're not. Sometimes it is the clergy who are being bullied and who go into an area where they don't actually hold the power. They do legally, but not in terms of the culture. And that's a very difficult thing. And I'm sure if I asked around this room who amongst the clergy who has felt bullied, a lot of hands might go up. And I've seen it in my previous diocese as well. And I think this is something that really needs addressing. There needs to be a way of saying to giving clergy a space where they can say, I'm being bullied, I'm not a pathetic, weak person, but I'm being bullied. And for that to be taken seriously, and for there to be some kind of consequence to those who are bullying.
Thank you, Kate, very much. That's really helpful. And if it hasn't yet happened, it will. But I know that when we looked at this charter, we did ask that it does end up on the agendas of all MACs. So either via the bishop's offices or directly from the RB, we should expect to find it in the next period of time very quickly as an urgent item for ministry area councils, mission area councils to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Grace, and I'm not seeing anybody else coming forward now, so we have reached 1 o'clock. The conclusion of agenda item 10